January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. We're going to do something this evening. Unless you want to sort of geek out a bit, I'm not sure you want to hang out for watching this, so maybe there's something good on Netflix. I want to walk through a couple financial debt concepts I tried sharing last week, just to help people sort of get their heads around something. And then we're going to actually just go through a couple top lines on the Social Security actuary report. Now, I got to admit, I haven't finished it. We've only just gone some of the very top lines. It's going to take me a week or two to work out all the math, but we want to make sure, because some of the headlines, I believe, were misleading on just still how difficult these numbers are. And then we're going to go through sort of understanding the scale of the problem. Then we're going to do a little bit of talking about optimism, and we're going to do some discussion about AI, artificial intelligence in government, and some of the bills we've actually already introduced. Thank you, you're very kind, just one. We've already introduced to disrupt the cost of this government. You know, you keep hearing sort of nasty, horrible, the world's coming into the end, and I'm going to argue that if we would get AI right, we can make a difference in government. So let's first walk through the first concept. How many of you remember a little while back, I think it was S&P, or was it Moody's? Maybe Moody's, downgraded U.S. debt. We've had 2 downgrades. Of the 3 large rating agencies, we've been downgraded twice. Now, I know every member of Congress and all of our staff read every word of it. But if you actually read it, there's an entire report about why they would downgrade U.S. debt. Now, it was more of a downgrade of future horizon. One of the number 1 reasons on that downgrade was governance. Now, the fact of the matter is the debt picture's off the charts. I'm going to show one here where I think we've now had our 4th day in the last couple of weeks where we went over $100,000 a second borrowing. But do you screw with your bankers? Because this is my passion, trying to convince our brothers and sisters here in Congress, you got to act like an adult. Have fights here. Actually know your math. Bend the cost of government. But don't do stupid things and then turn around. Because this week, understand, this week I believe the Treasury is going to market for like $125 billion. Our interest rates are actually slightly down this week compared to last week. But the fact those interest rates bounce up and down this much lets you know sort of how nervous the debt markets are. Remember, 2 weeks ago, lots of the fancy financial markets were writing stories about U.S. debt is getting harder to sell. This week, it looks like it's easier to sell. That fragility, and I know that's a big word, but it's the only one I have for this. Don't play a game here. We will pay $1.2 trillion in interest this year. Interest of the United States in this fiscal year will be the 2nd biggest expense in government. Social Security will be $1.45 trillion. Interest will be $1.2 trillion. Medicare, almost $1 trillion. Defense, $960, $980. Think of that. Defense is now the 4th biggest expense in government, no longer the 1st or 2nd. And part of that concept is, this one's a little more for those folks that like to think of themselves as sort of monetary policy folks. Think about what the Federal Reserve has been trying to do. They've been raising interest rates. They've been pulling liquidity. They've been holding back on buying bonds, doing just the opposite, letting their portfolio roll off. They're trying to pull liquidity out of society to squeeze inflation out. But this place has actually made that much harder to do. Besides the craziness of how much we spent in the Inflation Reduction Act, singularly the most Orwellian named piece of legislation in modern history, you do realize, and I was in the cloakroom a moment ago trying to do this math sort of off the top of my head. I think it's like $2.8 billion a day. that we pay in interest. That we pay in interest. The U.S. government pays to bondholders every day. So here's what you have. We're borrowing about $8.5 billion a day. We're paying out $2.8 billion a day in interest. The question is government borrowing really good for productivity in this society? Does government borrowing actually make us a wealthier society, a more prosperous society? Now, look, some borrowing is historic. You're going to do that. But the scale we're consuming, we are consuming much of the world's liquidity, not just the United States. The United States and China are the two big economies right now binging on debt. Europe actually has dialed back its debt. Remember, I did the presentation last week. I think there were 13 countries that had better credit ratings than the United States. Greece today has a better credit rating than the United States. Their 10-year bond is cheaper, lower in interest costs than the U.S. And much of that risk premium is governance. It's the belief saying, oh, the United States is going to use its tools to bend inflation. The United States is going to do the things necessary to actually lower its debt and borrowing. Are we? Because you see the conversations we have around here. Most of the time, these microphones are full of people coming up with new programs and new ways to spend money. So understand, I had two concepts I just walked you through. They're a little highbrow. First is you need to actually have a government that convinces the bond markets that we're serious, we respect our creditors. I mean, let's be honest. You borrow a bunch of money, you don't go in to your creditor and make a clown of yourself. And we need to do the same. And the second half is understand the economic mess we're doing. It's more than just the borrowing. It's the fact that you've pulled capital out of the markets that would have gone to more productive uses, and at the same time, then we're paying interest. Now we're paying interest that in some ways is higher than people who said, why would I take a risk premium and invest in something, a new plant, a new equipment, a new widget maker, those sorts of things, when I can get 5% on a 2-year, I'm going to do that. The scale of our debt is creating an economic distortion. And it's just a concept we need to understand that also in some ways, Congress, and this always drives people who believe it's Fed and liquidity, but in many ways, Congress, because of our borrowing, has actually created this liquidity cycle where we borrow and then we're pumping out interest. We borrow it and then we're giving you almost a premium on the interest rate and we're paying you out. It's a real problem. And in many ways, we've made the Federal Reserve job even more difficult, squeezing inflation out. And almost no one has actually spent time on that. There's a couple good academic articles if you want to geek out. All right. We use this chart over and over and over because we're trying to help people understand. Do you see the blue? The blue is what we get to vote on. You do understand every dime a member of Congress votes on is borrowed, and part of this. So interest, this number is wrong now. Interest, if you do a gross interest, is 1.2. Publicly borrowed interest is probably, it may be somewhere near that, $900 billion. But this is interest, this is Social Security, this is Medicare, this is Medicaid, this is other mandatory programs. These are earned benefits. You worked your 40 quarters, you get your maximum Social Security. You worked so much, you get Medicare. But I need you also to be willing to hear some very difficult math of how Medicare is actually financed to understand its impact on the debt and deficits. There are other benefits out there that are in the formula. You get because we have a treaty obligation with you for some of our Native American populations. You fall below a certain income. You get certain subsidies, those sorts of things. Those are also considered mandatory programs. But the point here is the vast majority of U.S. spending, your member of Congress never, ever, ever gets to vote on. And we need to change that. We need to start telling the truth that we're hemorrhaging cash. And at these interest rates, you've got to understand what we're doing to your retirement and your kids' futures. So let's actually walk through. I just do this board. You can actually go to my website and sign up. There's a little thing there you sign up for. Give us your phone number. We'll send you a text message every single day called the Daily Debt. We've been doing this for several months now. You get a little text that says, here's what we borrowed today. Here's what the gross borrowing is. We do the last 365 days, or this year 366 days because of leap year. And over here, we do the fiscal year. When you look here at the total gross, now remember, that's borrowing from the trust funds as well as publicly issued. We've now gone 4 days in the last couple of weeks where we went over $100,000 a second. A second. And for anyone there that has a relative who doesn't believe the debt's a big deal, sign them up. Send us their phone number. We'll send them a text message every day, and they can start to understand the scale of how much this U.S. economy now is in debt. Remember, think about that. If the U.S. economy is about 28, 29 trillion, and we're going to borrow this year, publicly borrow, not total borrowing, publicly borrow maybe 2.7, 2.8 trillion, you're functionally borrowing what, 9% of the entire economy? That's remarkable. I'm hoping I'm wrong. CBO thought we'd only be about 5.4%. But if you look at our current burn rate, the concept, and why that's important. Remember, I've come here and done the presentation of the left's version of, let's tax people over 400,000. You do it and you say, okay, there's this concept of tax maximization where I can tax your income to a certain point, but the next percent of tax on you, it rolls over. You actually say, screw it, I'm not going to work as much. It's basically a concept based off sort of the Laffer curve concept. But you can get the same thing in capital gains. How much of capital gains today is just inflation? It's not actually appreciation of your asset, it's inflation changes of your asset. Estate taxes, your pass-throughs, all those things. And the math came out to about 1.5, 1.6% of GDP you could get by taxing those, tax maximizing everything for those over $400,000. Play this math with me. If it's 1.5% of the economy, and you have a year, so far this year, we're borrowing over 9% of the economy. Does that give you an idea? And those of us who want to cut spending, you know, if you're not allowed to touch defense, and if you're not allowed to touch any of that mandatory I just showed you, you have the non-defense discretionary spending, that, what was it? Let's call it $900 billion. Can you get 1% of GDP? 1.5%? Yeah, you could cut all sorts of programs. Remember, the Bloomberg economists a year ago put out a report saying if you took $100 billion out of non-defense discretionary, you actually lower GDP about 0.5%. So everyone who says, we're going to cut and we're going to pretend the economy is going to grow at this rate, that's not how the math works. Now, in the long run, you have more capital stock, those things. But in the short run, you actually lower GDP with these cuts. You just got to deal with it. It's the reality of economics and math. So one of the things I wanted to go through is very few people here have ever paid much attention to Medicare and how we finance it. And where does the money come from? You had the president behind that podium that made it sound like, we're never going to touch Medicare, or you're not allowed to talk about Social Security, and we're going to actually raise these taxes for Medicare. Okay, you got to understand, you see this red area there? Think of that as Medicare Part A. That's the trust fund. That's when you pay your payroll tax, a little slice of that goes to this right here. That's the trust fund that bounces up and down. So one day it's 6 years away from running out. Now it's 2035 because of some changes and good employment in the economy. But it's really sensitive. This blue here, most folks don't understand. The majority here, the biggest single slice of the pie of Medicare comes right out of the general fund. So when we talk about healthcare costs going up, they're already up over 7% this year. Excuse me, 10% this year. Tax receipts are up 7, but Medicare costs are up 10. That's a huge hit on the general fund. And over here, you see this, that's actually premiums, and then here's some actual state transfers and those things, some of the dual eligibles and some of those things. But you have a lot of folks who run around here somehow thinking Medicare is financed off the FICA tax, the payroll tax. And it's not. It's about a third of the spending. And why that's important is the actuary report that came out yesterday actually was okay on Medicare. We gained a few years, but the reason, if you really dig into it, it's these minute changes and I believe unrealistically optimistic numbers that healthcare costs are going to stabilize, even though this year Medicare costs are up 10%. So I don't know how they justified those two numbers. Guess what I'm going to do the next week or two? We're going to read every line and try to figure out what they were saying in here. Welcome to my life. But when you see this Part A here, now we're doing it in blue, that's actually part of your payroll tax. The Part B and Part D, those are substantially coming out of the general fund. So it turns out Medicare is, the biggest single, other than interest, is the biggest spend out of the general fund. Because Social Security, until the trust fund's gone, does not have a general fund aspect. Social Security is self-financed right now. It's payroll tax and trust fund. But that's why so many of us are freaked out that is it 8 years, 9 years? Is it now 2035 or 2034? And we're going to get to that because I need you to understand they played a little game where they combined the disability trust fund number and the old age survivor fund number. So the old age survivor was still at 2033, but then you roll in disability actually because so many people are able to work in the new economy. Its number was better, so they combined the two, and that's where you really got some of the added time on the trust fund. Yay! All right, now let's go to the place that gets a lot of people really cranky. But we're going to tell you the truth. Need to process this because you've had people in the political class, the media class, the fraud information class that comes through these things tell you stories about Social Security and Medicare that just mathematically aren't true. So let's get ready for the truth. And this is based on an average couple, not an individual, average couple. And this number is updated. So look, the average couple in a lifetime, this is an average in America based on, I think we're actually basing this on a 2023 number. Average couple will pay in $783,000 in their lifetime in Social Security taxes. It's amazing. And how many people will you hear say, but they stole my money? No, actually, it turns out that average couple gets every dime of that back. Benefits they'll receive will be about $831,000. So $70-some thousand spiff. Okay. Crap rate of return. You got to understand, George Bush wrote 20-some years ago when they talked about taking just a tiny slice of your money and allowing you to control it and put it into other types of accounts, you would have had stunning more money. The left beat the crap out of Republicans over that. They're trying to privatize. That wasn't the deal. We can look back now, you got lied to. You got played for fools. But we got what we want. So the average American actually gets every dime back of their Social Security plus a little spiff. Horrible rate of return, but you get it all back. That isn't where the crisis is. What crushes the future federal debt and deficit is the Medicare portion. That same average couple in that lifetime will pay in $214,000 into that Medicare Part A trust fund. Now remember, I already showed you the majority of Medicare doesn't actually come from the trust fund. It covers about 35% of spending. The rest comes in from your premiums, from the general fund, from some state transfers, other things. So that average couple is going to pay $214,000 in taxes into Medicare. They're going to get $635,000 in benefits. That difference there is the number one driver of U.S. debt. Political class, it's so dangerous to tell you the truth because it makes our core voters cranky. It's not your fault. We as a society, we made a deal with all of us. You know, these are earned benefits. You made a deal. You worked your 40 quarters for Social Security. You worked your time. You paid your taxes. You got 65. That was the societal deal. But what this place didn't do is think about the cost of health care. We were so terrified to force, to incentivize, to require, to encourage, to prod innovation, disruptions in cost. So we committed a fraud here, and this fraud has gone on here for decades. We tell you, Obamacare, we're doing something on health care. Obamacare was a finance bill. It's who had to pay taxes and who got subsidized. Our Republican bill. It was better, it fixed part of the actuarial curve problem, but it was still a finance bill. It's who had to pay and who got subsidized. See the difference? And Medicare for All is a financing bill because we don't talk about what health care actually costs. And that's what we're going to end on, is how we could just, I'm going to give you some of the basic ideas of what we could do, the morality of disrupting the cost of health care. But this is uncomfortable because I've done this at public meetings and I get booed by my friends because a lot of people don't want to be told every dime of U.S. borrowing from today through the next 30 years, every dime, that's according to CBO and a bunch of the outside groups, every dime, interest, Medicare, and if in let's use the actuary, 2035, it's actually just the very beginning of 2035, and one economic bump, it comes back down to 2033. Instead of the 25% cut you're heading towards getting in Social Security, if that gets paid out of the general fund, those three things are calculated to be 100% of the borrowing. And here is the 2024 CBO long-term debt report that I know every member of Congress here read, every line. When I started doing this presentation a few years ago, the long-term debt was $116 trillion. Remember, I just told you it's interest and health care. And then if we backfill Social Security, now it's $141 trillion. So as of March, when CBO did their long-term number, it's no longer $116 trillion, it's $141. And if these interest rates stick around, which our economists say they're going to, because we're still not at the historic norm. How many members of Congress have gotten in front of you and told you the truth that 100% of borrowing from today through the next 30 years, the growth of it, the growth, interest, health care, if we backfill Social Security in 10 years, and now it's $141 trillion. There's a way to make this work. Are you willing to adopt technology? And some of it's incredibly simple stuff. I'm going to do a slight non sequitur here, but I've done it over time because it's so easy to understand. We calculate, and there's multiple studies saying this, 16% of all U.S. healthcare is people that get sick or have a stroke or heart attack or these things because they didn't stay on. Someone like me, can you imagine me with someone who drinks 7, 8 cups of coffee a day? I have hypertension. And as long as I take my calcium inhibitor, I'm not likely to have a stroke. If you are diabetic, if you follow your regime, you should be fine. 16% of U.S. healthcare is people that don't follow their regimen. That's $600 billion this year in healthcare costs. You care about U.S. debt? Think about something crazy. You could actually just do a pill bottle that beeps at the cap for 99 cents, beeps at you, say, hey, did you take your statin? Did you take your hypertension medicine? 99 cents. And you'd be amazed, this place, I've had that piece of legislation for years around here. I could no more get a hearing here because, well, that's creative. Maybe maybe the outside world likes having sick people because they make money off them. And that's incredibly cynical for me to say it. But how much revolutionary pieces of legislation do you see coming through here that are simple, easy to understand, and make huge differences in the cost of healthcare? No, David, a pill bottle cap that beeps at me that might save us $100 billion. Well, we can't do that. Why the hell not? It's almost immoral. And look, I've done this before trying to show you that over the next couple decades, it's actually Medicare starts to consume approaching 7% of the entire economy, just that. You start to add in Social Security, that's going 5.9%, and you start to understand when you're starting to look at numbers of 13, 14% of the entire economy is just those two programs. You're probably not going to change Social Security. That's an earned benefit. But you could change the cost of healthcare by introducing technology disruptions, other business models, if this place was willing to be just somewhat creative, maybe read some of the journals out there. And we're going to talk about some of those disruptions that are coming. Should I make you actually understand that in 2034, the deficits, how much is the reason I have this chart is I'm trying to help folks understand how far we missed. If you and I go back a year ago, at one point we were saying, hey, we're going to have about a $1.3 trillion borrowing. And then it went up saying, oh, it might be 1.6. How do we get expected deficits where we're missing numbers this much? And understanding the economic effects of what it actually does to economic growth. When the smart people we keep turning to over the administration, even our own CBO, are missing these numbers by 100%. You know, when a year or two later, the debt numbers double. Does that let you understand something? If the economy is decent. Now, you don't also what happened, a week ago Friday. We went from this, hey, we're running at a 2.8, 2.9% GDP. Oh, sorry, we were wrong. First quarter was only 1.7. There's something wrong in our data collection. And I don't know if it's the continued impacts of inflation making your life feel much heavier, much more stressed. But this stuff, it doesn't have to be terrifying. There are ways to attack it if you're willing to read, willing to be part of action. So let's say this chart's been around forever, and it just keeps getting uglier every time it gets updated. But trying to help you understand current baseline debt, and then with some of the policy changes and the higher interest rates, just the baseline debt. Now remember, we're running substantially higher than this year. But long-term baseline, they're saying, hey, you're just going to start being just the borrowing. Will be 5, 6, 7% of the entire economy. And long run, debt, if you go the 30-year window, debt starts to approach 32% of entire GDP. Now, do you think the bond markets are ever going to let us get anywhere near that? So you tell me, where in this line here do we blow up? And it's not a crash. What it is you got to turn on the printing presses. You start to inflate your way out. All your savings gets devalued. Remember, okay, a concept. I've done 2 or 3 presentations on this here. What's the biggest tax hike in modern history? You're living it. Understand, you are living it. The last 3 years of the Biden administration, the higher inflation. So in my district, unless you right now make about 24% more today than you did the day the president took office. You got to understand, during that time, if you're not making about 24%, you are poor if you live in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area. If you're not making the 24%, you have the right to be cranky. Because that was a transfer of your wealth to the U.S. debt. Because we lowered the value of your purchasing power, but we now pay it back. We pay back the U.S. debt because the United States is the largest debtor in the world. We now pay it back with inflated dollars. It's a tax. Whether you understand it or not, inflation is a tax. Welcome to the biggest tax in modern history, and you just lived it. And have you wondered ever why so many of our brothers and sisters on the left despise it when we talk about inflation? Because it worked for them. It turns out when you have that inflation, the size of the debt as a percentage of GDP sort of flatlines a bit until the new higher interest rates come slamming into you. And that's where we're at now. So, look, let's do some optimistic stuff, or semi-optimistic. I want us to think about how disruptive we can be if we actually read and if we think. So, I think my staff who made this one got a little carried away. But you do realize, I think we just had the 8th OMB report that's saying the Pentagon is unauditable. They cannot audit it. Okay, so do you really know your inventory? Do we know how many assets we have? Turns out we can't audit them. So why not do something crazy? How about this idea of, turns out we have multiple companies now that have designed artificial intelligence AI audit crawlers that crawl through every asset list, every inventory list, every bookkeeping entry, everything. You could actually audit the Pentagon. You just have to now use technology, not a building full of people. Okay? We have this as a piece of legislation. If it works, you could then unleash this type of technology on the fraudsters in Medicare, the durable medical equipment fraudsters, the billing fraudsters. How about all up and down government to find the waste and fraud? The technology can do it because we and our army of auditors can't seem to do it. Shocking, can you believe I can't get a hearing on this? AI audited the Pentagon. You would think this would be a no-brainer. But this place is terrified of the very technology that can save us. So let's actually walk through a couple other ideas. How about if I came to you and said we could fast-track a drug, a vaccine, and for anyone that's actually watching and curious, I want you right now to grab your favorite search engine on your phone and look up a fentanyl vaccine. There's also one for cocaine, a cocaine vaccine. Turns out it's in trials right now where they figured out how to block the receptor. The cocaine one, because it's not a synthetic, it's actually a protein. I think the vaccine actually attaches to the protein. What is the morality in a society when you're approaching 100,000 of our brothers and sisters who die every year of a synthetic opioid? What happens when law enforcement pulls over someone coming out of southern Arizona and they have fentanyl tablets or powder shoved in their glove box, and that law enforcement officer is exposed to it and is having to slam Narcan into his system? I'm told in the Phoenix area we have one dead homeless person a day, almost always from fentanyl. Why isn't this moral? Why isn't the morality of, if they're really heading towards this technology, let's fast track it. Let's do an X Prize. Let's find some way to get it in our community and try it. Maybe it doesn't work. There's all sorts of other ethical, moral applications to, does someone have to be in their right mind? Do they have to have sobered up to be able to make the decision to take something that keeps them from being able to have receptors for the synthetic opioid? But embrace these things. How many more people have to die? You think I'm ever going to get a hearing on this? These are moral. They're also great for the economy. How many people could come back into society, into the labor force, actually mitigate their addiction? These are moral, and they're also great economics. So let's actually walk through some of the other things going on that are wonderful. But we have to figure out here, are we going to do things to help finance it because it doesn't work right now? Today, the very first patient here in actually DC began the process of having their sickle cell cured. Now, it's a rigorous process, but it's a cure of one of the most expensive diseases in this country. I once again argue, my team argues, the morality is in the cure, and also it's great economics. When you have a population that suffers a painful, painful disease, and there's a path to cure them now, because this has been FDA approved, and it's going into the first patient right now outside the trials. Let's actually walk through this. You know, right now there's a revolution happening in really smart labs all over America where they're using AI to design the next generation of drugs. There's a great story for last week, I think it was in Wired magazine if you want to geek out, saying that AI produced a small molecule drug that no one had ever thought of. And at least on the computer simulator, it has amazing efficacy. Why wouldn't we promote, why wouldn't we work with the FDA that's saying we have the ability to do the data sets much faster, bring these things to market faster, cure people faster? Or is a 1930s, 1940s FDA model what we're still going to stand behind? A cancer vaccine, particularly one we've already had the conversation for one on melanoma, this one is for brain cancer, is actually going into trials. How do we help these things come to market faster? Because it's moral. It also saves boatloads of cash. I showed you healthcare costs are our primary driver. Do you do what the troglodytes around here say? Well, we'll just cut reimbursements. You can stand and sit in the waiting line longer. Or do this, cure people. Look, we have about a half a dozen AI bills just for healthcare. The concept of bringing technology faster, using AI to find fraudsters, using AI for back office. So you're a doctor's office or medical clinic using AI saying, hey, look, if it's called AI clean claims. Instead of going through the rigmarole, boom, you just match up the insurance companies or the Medicare's or the rules, and if they match, boom, it's paid. You just cut the staffing. Yes, it does remove some people. It also removes a hell of a lot of costs. I talked to you about using AI to audit the Pentagon. The fact of the matter is, this is the MedPAC report from 3 weeks ago. And I know every member of Congress read it. But there's one thing in here, when you go through it, that explodes at you. And that basically says, sorry, it's falling apart, we've been using it so much. That basically says, into this decade, Medicare will be about 23% of every corporate tax dollar and personal tax dollar we collect. That's from 13% to 23%. And that's coming in just a few more years. There's this term called a black swan. That's when something sneaks up on you, blows you up, and you weren't expecting it. This is called a white swan. You know it's coming for you, and you choose to do nothing about it. I know I come behind this microphone every week, and I'm almost mentally exhausted because is anyone listening? There are solutions. Our problem is the clock is ticking. The on-ramp to bring those solutions to market to actually have an effect on our debt and borrowing and economic growth. I think we only have 3, 4, 5 more years. But you've got to deal with the real numbers. When this place borrows $8.5 billion a day, and we will lose our minds over things that mathematically are rounding errors, when we've done things in this body that have made the bond markets nervous, when a single basis point, so 1% of interest has 100 basis points. A single basis point just this year costs us about $800 million. And I've watched us say, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to curse on the floor. I've watched us have debates where we say absolutely insane things, and you can almost watch parts of the market saying, nope, I think U.S. debt just got riskier because these people aren't serious about economic growth and stability.
Mr. Speaker, there's ways to make this work. Is anyone listening? With that, I yield back.